chapters 18 and 19 together. 18 and 19. We've seen that because of their murmurings against him, the Lord allowed the Israelites to be attacked by the Amalekites. This is what we concluded last week. These people, the children of God, were just journeying through this area. They weren't bothering anybody. The Amalekites had not been injured. They had not been threatened by the Israelites. Their attack upon God's people was wholly unprovoked, and it was designed to manifest their hatred and defiance of God, and that they wanted to destroy the very people of God. But when Amalek came and fell upon these wearied and defenseless children of God, they sealed their nation's doom. In the battle, we saw where, as long as Moses was able to keep his hands up, that the children of Israel prevailed, and eventually Aaron and Hur had to support Moses' hands, and they prevailed over the Amalekites. When the battle was over, we find that not very far from where the Israelites were encamped was the home of Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses. And Jethro had heard of the deliverance of the Hebrews, and now he sets out to meet with Moses and to reunite Moses with his wife and with his two sons. Moses is told by some messengers that his father-in-law and family are approaching, and he goes out to meet them and then conducts them back to his tent. This is the first part of Exodus chapter 18, the first several verses. You see, Moses, if you remember, when he'd gone into Egypt, had sent his wife and his children back to Jethro, and he wanted to keep them safe. And now that he was away from Egypt, he could enjoy the relief and the comfort of their company once more. As Jethro comes and stays in the camp, he soon began to see some things happening that concerned him very, very much. And he saw all of these burdens that were resting upon Moses. And so what was happening was that in order to maintain order and discipline among this million or so people, that Moses was dealing with all of the problems that were arising, and it was a stupendous task. Moses was the recognized leader. He was the magistrate, and not only the general interests and duties of the people, but the controversies that even arose among a couple of people bickering was brought before Moses. And he permitted this because it gave him an opportunity to instruct them in the things of God. But in chapter 18, we see where his father-in-law sees what's happening here, and he addresses the issue with Moses in chapter 18 and verse 17. Watch what takes place. And Moses' father-in-law said unto him, The thing that thou doest is not good. Well, here's the father-in-law giving some advice. And Jethro goes on and he warns about what's happening there, and he counsels Moses to appoint proper persons as rulers of thousands and other rulers of hundreds and rulers of 10, and he breaks it down into an organization so that all of the burden isn't carried upon one person. It's kind of like the structure that we have even within the church. If everything goes to the pastor, well, the pastor will either roll up in a ball and give up and die, or just wear himself weary. So problems within the church don't just have to come to the pastor. We have elders, we have deacons, we have deaconesses, we have other leaders within the church that carry part of the responsibility, both of the physical and the spiritual needs of the congregation. And so the people that were to be chosen to assist Moses were, it says in the scriptures, to be able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. That also is applicable within the church today. It is the very things that we look for in the spiritual leaders of God's people. All of God's leaders today should be able, they should fear God, they should be people who are truthful, honest, and people who are not covetous. These people that were set up at this time in chapter 18 were to judge in all matters of minor consequences, while the most difficult and important cases only were now to be brought before Moses. This counsel that Moses' father-in-law gave him was accepted, and it not only brought relief to Moses, but it resulted in creating a perfect order of things among the people of God. Now in chapter 18, drop down just a little further and look at verse 23. It says, this is Jethro speaking to Moses, if thou shalt do this thing, and God command thee so. You see, God was speaking to Moses here through Jethro. He says, if you do this, and God commands you to, then you shall be able to endure, and all this people shall also go to their place in peace. So Moses hearkened to the voice of his father-in-law, and did all that he had said. You see, even the main leader needs to listen to counsel from other people of wisdom. And so this is why that when we meet as a board or an elders meeting or any of these type of meetings, it is counsel so that we can better understand from the input from the other spiritual leaders in the church. I was in the church, it's been a couple of years ago, one of our churches in this area. The pastor there was bragging about all of the stuff that he was doing in the church and so forth. And I said, well, what do you do? How do you convince your board to do all of these things? He said, what board? I said, the church board. He said, what church board? I said, you mean you don't have one? And he kind of puffed up and says, you're looking at it. That's dictatorial, friends. That is not according to God's plan. And we must heed the counsel that God sends to us through the various leaders within the church. So the Lord had greatly honored Moses and had wrought wonders by his hand, but the fact that he had been chosen to instruct others did not lead him to conclude that he himself needed no instruction. We all need counsel from time to time. The chosen leader of Israel, chosen by God himself to lead 1 million people, gladly listened to the suggestions of this godly priest of Midian and adopted his father-in-law's plan and wise advice. And the people prospered as they journeyed through that wilderness. Now when we come into chapter 19, it says, in the 3rd month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai. For they were departed from Rephidim, and were come to the desert of Sinai, and had pitched in the wilderness, and there Israel camped before the mount. So from Rephidim, the people now continue their journey. They follow this cloudy pillar that leads them on. They are now just in the 3rd month. They've only been gone from Egypt for 90 days now. And as they journey on, their route led them across these barren plains, over those steep ascents, and through all of those rocky ruins. Those of you that have been over in that area can see what a vast area of nothingness lies there. Often as they traveled across these sandy wastes, they had seen before them nothing but rugged mountains looming before them like huge bulwarks. They piled up directly across their course, and you wonder, how are we going to get through there when we arrive there? It seemed to stop all further progress, but as they came into that area following the cloud, the openings here and there appeared in that mountain wall, and another plain opened up before them on the other side. And it was through one of these deep passes that they were now to be led. It was a grand and impressive scene. If you could have been up in an airplane looking down at 1 million people going between these rocky cliffs rising hundreds of feet on either side, here flowed this living tide of people, 1 million or more of them, as far as the eye could see, with all of their flocks and their herds. And God was providing everything those people needed every step of the way. And now before them, as they come through this one last pass, there loomed before them Mount Sinai. There it rose above the other peaks in a solemn majesty. And the cloudy pillar moved over onto that peak and settled down on the top of it and assured them of the divine protection that was there. This was to be their home now for nearly a year. For a year, they are going to camp around that mountain. As they camped at night, the pillar of fire continued to assure them of God's divine protection. And while they slept, the bread of heaven fell gently upon the ground for them to gather as they arose the next morning. And at this spot, Israel was to receive the most wonderful revelation ever made by God to men. The only instructions that man received from God, that God did not send through a mediator. God is going to do it himself. Here the Lord had gathered his people in this plain that he might impress upon them the sacredness of his requirements by declaring with his own voice his holy law. Great and radical changes were to be wrought within these people. For the degrading influences of this years of servitude and the long continued association with idolatry had left their marks upon the people's habits and upon their character. And God was working to lift them to a higher and higher moral level by giving them a knowledge of himself. Soon after they set up camp there at Sinai, Moses is called upon the mountain to meet and to commune with God. Alone, this man climbed through the steep and rugged paths to the top. There he drew near to the cloud that marked the very presence of the great God of heaven. Israel was now to be taken into a very close and peculiar relationship to the Most High. They were to be incorporated both as a church and as a nation under the government of God. They were to become a theocracy. And the message of Moses to the people is found beginning with verse 4 here. Notice what God says. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then you shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. And Moses came and called for the leaders of the people, and laid before their faces all these words which the Lord commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. And Moses returned the words of the people unto the Lord. You see here, God purposed to make the occasion of speaking his law a scene of splendid grandeur, in keeping with its exalted character. The people were to be impressed that everything that was connected with the service of God must be regarded with greatest reverence. This is something that God's people today have pretty well lost sight of. During these intervening days that they were there, all were to occupy the time in solemn preparation to appear before God. We today are living in a time of preparation to appear before the King of Kings when he soon comes. Are we using that time wisely? Are we making the needed preparation? The people's clothing had to be freed from any impurities. And as Moses points out their sins, they are to devote themselves to humiliation, to fasting and prayer, that their hearts might be cleansed from all iniquity. As you read this whole chapter, these things just come out so powerfully. The preparations now are made according to the command, and in obedience to further injunction, Moses now tells them to put a barrier around the mountain, that neither man nor beast should come within that barrier, because if they come across there, they would die instantly. God wants to impress them with his holiness. So they put the barrier around so that people would know how far they could go and where they should stop, unless they wanted to die. And then in verse 16, watch what he says. And it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the nether part of the mount. 3 days of preparation over. On the third morning, as the eyes of the people were turned toward the mount, all of a sudden its summit is covered with a thick cloud. It grew more and more black, and it got denser and denser, and it began to sweep downward until the whole mountain was wrapped in this darkness and this awful mystery. The whole mountain seemed to be swallowed up in this cloud. Then there is the sound of a trumpet, and it's summoning the people to meet with God. And Moses led them all up to the base of the mountain. From the thick darkness, it says that there flashed out these vivid lightnings, and peals of thunder echoed and re-echoed through the surrounding areas. It says in verse 18 there, watch this. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. There's some traumatic things taking place here. The earth begins to shake. You know that every time some spectacular thing took place, that the earth shook? You know, you go back to Calvary. When Jesus died on the cross, it says that there was a great earthquake. The earthquake was so great that it opened up graves. That earthquake went through and went all the way down. It split the sacrificial stone, I believe, at the temple. It went on through there. If you go and look where the temple is built today, the new Dome of the Rock, they've got it built a little cockeyed there from what the original was, but that stone was there, and it split right through. The Muslims say that it split when Muhammad ascended back to heaven, that the rock wanted to follow Muhammad, and Gabriel pushed it back down and broke it, told it had to stay. That's a myth. But reality is that represented the place where the Son of God was to die. It was the altar of sacrifice. And when it split, That earthquake went right on down to as far as Mozambique in Africa. You could see the results of it even to this day, going down through Qumran and down by where the Dead Sea Scrolls were, past the Dead Sea. The whole world was shaken up because the Son of God had died. And God wanted everybody to be aware that something spectacular happened. When God brought His people out of captivity and brought them to the Mount of the Law, it says that it all shook. And it's quite interesting that at that time an earthquake went out, stretched out into the Mediterranean and Aegean Sea, and all the way up to a place today that is called Santorini. Santorini is a little island, part of the Greek islands. It is in the Aegean Sea, about 200 kilometers, or about 120 miles south of the Greek mainland. And in this island, what is interesting about it is there's a great lagoon right in the center of what's left of Santorini. And this lagoon is 8 miles long and 4 miles wide, and it is surrounded with cliffs on 3 sides that are nearly 1,000 feet high, 984 feet high cliffs on 3 sides. The island is the site of the largest volcanic eruption this planet has ever seen. And I believe that it happened when Mount Sinai shook. And what happened was that at that time, the Minoan civilization was one of the most popular and powerful. They were a seagoing people. And in about 1500, in this area where the earth shook, we find that this volcano, which was where this big lagoon is now, erupted. This gigantic eruption, and the eruption was so great it destroyed the volcano itself, and it collapsed in on itself and destroyed that whole area in the center where the island was and made a great cauldron. Now the shock waves to us today, we should have a little idea because we've seen a couple of these happen in recent years, where the earthquakes out in the ocean cause what? Tsunamis. Now can you imagine the size of a tsunami that would take out a whole civilization? As that volcano collapsed in, it created a great hole. When it erupted, it shut the waters away from it. And then when it collapsed in, it made a hole and everything came back and washed into what was remaining of Santorini. In the 14th century BC, they have found some archaeological things over there. And one of the texts in the archaeological discoveries from this period of time, shortly after Sinai, the text says it calls upon all the gods to make sure to grant primacy to an unknown entity that they called Kirasija, which I have no idea who it is, but I sure got a pretty good idea who it probably was. They probably called upon all other gods to give primacy to the God that had never been heard of before, that shook the earth and brought all of the attention of that whole part of the world to the people of God as they came out of captivity. The glory of the Lord, it tells us here in chapter 19, was like a devouring fire on the top of Mount Sinai in the sight of that assembled multitude. It says that the voice of the trumpet sounded long, and it waxed louder and louder. And so terrible were the tokens of God's presence that the hosts of Israel shook with fear and fell upon their faces before the Lord. In Hebrews, we see where even Moses exclaimed, I exceedingly fear and quake. What a spectacular event that must have been. And now, as the thunders ceased, the trumpet is no longer heard, and the earth is once again still. There is a period of solemn silence, and then the voice of God is heard. God revealed himself not only in the awful majesty of the judge and lawgiver, but as the compassionate guardian of the people. God speaks and he says, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And from there, he begins to tell them his commandments. You see, look at the first 2 verses of chapter 20. God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, which have brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. This law that we're going to be looking at in 2 weeks, by the way, did it get announced that communion is next Sabbath? It has been now announced. We do have communion. So in 2 weeks we will come back and study this law. This law that is given in this 20th chapter was not spoken at this time simply for the benefit of the Hebrews. God honored his people by making them the guardians and the keepers of his law. But this law was to be held as a sacred trust for the entire world. The precepts of this law are adapted to all mankind in all places, and they were given for the instruction and the government of all people. They are 10 precepts. They are brief, yet comprehensive. They are authoritative. They are not 10 suggestions. And it says here that these commandments are to cover the duty of man to God and to his fellow man. This is what Jesus was talking about when he said, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength, and with all of your mind. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This law is our responsibilities to God and to one another, and it is based upon the great principle of love. If you love God with all your heart and soul and mind, you will keep those first 4 commandments. And if you love your fellow man, then you will keep the last 6. In the 10 commandments, these principles are carried out in detail and made applicable to the condition and circumstances of all men at all times and in all places. As the children of Israel journeyed, they kept losing sight of the fact that God was leading them all the time. All the way that they went, he was always there with them. Today, he says, I will be with you always. He says that he will come to us and abide with us if we will keep these commandments. And so I just encourage you this week, the next 2 weeks that you actually have, to study these commandments very, very closely. Study them, pray over them, get you some commentaries, and take a look at what God says. Go to the Spirit of Prophecy. If you've got the CD on the computer, go to that and just look at each of these commandments individually and see what God is saying to you. And remember that God is leading you all the way from here